A little bit.
Well done, Bob.
All those awards just mean is that you're getting old.
You're just getting started.
The privilege for us is to have played a role in the lives of so many spectacular people like you here in the room. And one of the notes says, "What's your trick to staying happily married?" I'm not so sure it's all that happy. She can really be difficult, but. So you're going to tell them the rules for that? Yeah, we used to when we were doing these 2-day ground schools, we'd come back, and we were two flight instructors in the same airplane, which is always a bad deal, and there was a tendency for the person who wasn't flying to think that they should be instructing the person who was flying, and whether invited or not. And the pilot who was flying, regardless who it was, didn't particularly appreciate the unsolicited instruction. And so we'd come home, and we'd get home after having been to Fargo, North Dakota, with smoke just literally coming out of our ears. We're just furious with each other and not speaking while we drive home. And the person who was receiving the unsolicited instruction was really annoyed that they were being ignored. Or that they were getting unsolicited instruction. The other instructor was upset because they were being ignored. And so one time I was telling a friend of ours, Bob Wagstaff, a well-known name in aviation, how difficult Martha is, and that we were arguing on all the way home. And he says, "Well, I can fix that for you." I said, "Oh, no, you're not going to fix this for us. We've been having this problem for years. You're not going to fix this for us." He says, "No, I can fix that for you." I said, "Okay." He says, I said, "Yeah, no, you're not." He says, "I can." He says, "I can do it, and I can do it with one word." And I said, "Okay, what's the word?" And he says, "The word is captain." He said, if you have a comment when Martha is flying, for instance, that you want to make to Martha, start that sentence with the word captain. And that conveys that you are not trying to undermine her authority and that you fail to respect her. It just conveys you want to give her some information. And he says there's a couple other rules. Well, one is you can give the captain information, but you cannot give your opinion. He says, for instance, John, you can say to Martha, "Captain, you're below glide path, sink 1,000." But what you cannot say is, "Martha, you're too goddamn low." And so we use that. And when Martha and I fly together, we fly an airplane that requires 2 pilots. We actually, the co-pilot will call the captain. And we do that. People who ride with us, we have headsets set in every seat in the airplane. And the reason for that is be cruel and unusual punishment to make somebody ride in an airplane and not let them know what's going on. So they're almost all pilots. We're all pilots, so we all have headsets. So I call Martha captain. She calls me captain when I happen to be fortunate enough to be captain. And that's actually worked in our partnership, in our business partnership. It's worked in our marriage, and it really does work. And I guess there's that song, RESPCT, if you know how to spell it, respect. And that's the key for us. And the other thing is, and I'll say this, and I do say it, and I genuinely mean it, I want to make it clear. Martha's just a little bit better pilot than I am. And the reason I say that is Martha is situationally aware. She's way out ahead of the airplane, and she can tell you what's going to happen next in the next 10 minutes, 15 minutes, an hour. And I'm going, well, what the hell just happened? So Martha's approach to life is being way ahead of things, and it makes her a better pilot. And it's that way in our business and our marriage, everything else is going on. Martha's extremely aware and knows what's going on. So that's the trick to it. And the fact that we get along with each other is one of the reasons we're still eating regularly, because we haven't managed to destroy our marriage. We haven't managed to destroy our business, and we're still doing it. But I'll tell you, our toughest times ever have been in an airplane. Oh, yeah, absolutely. And those of you who fly with a spouse understand that idea, particularly if they're also a pilot. And Martha, good communication and respect for each other is what each other's abilities is what it really boils down to. Captain, this evening is going to go on forever if we don't get on with the presentation.
Yes.
So why don't you get the presentation up for us?
Are we ready for that, Gabe?
Yeah, you are ready to roll.
Okay,
Thank you.
I'm going to
Yep.
bring my screen up here.
All right, so we're still there, folks. Hello.
Yep.
And the title of the talk, and I'm really going to make it we're going to make it just a relaxed discussion, I think, more than a formal presentation. We don't want to be too big about it, but the title of the talk is How to Avoid Unwanted Adventure, and then we normally throw onto it and still have fun. And one of the things that I want to observe, and we've already observed this to some extent, but that this is a group of extraordinary human beings, because you're pilots. And one of the things, one of the highest compliments I can pay to someone is to observe they're not normal, because doing extraordinary things is not ordinary. And learning to fly requires so many different things. It requires emotional skill, physical skill, it requires knowledge, it requires risk management. And you put all of these things together and you command this airplane and take it into the air. And it's an extraordinary thing, and it requires extraordinary people. You became a pilot because you did something very difficult over an extraordinarily long period of time, and you persisted over a long period of time and accomplished what you set out to do. And one of the things that you are, which makes you so extraordinary, is that you are used to accomplishing what you set out to do. And the reason it happens is you're an extremely goal-oriented person. And I'm going to tell you that being goal-oriented is normally a very good thing in life, but in an airplane, it's a risk factor. And so part of what we're going to talk about, how you can take that risk factor and deal with it successfully in an airplane. Because I really believe that you have to ask, why do we see so many airplane accidents, or aircraft accidents, I could say, and why did that person keep on going in front of so many risks? And the reason is they're used to accomplishing what you set out to do. And that's a good thing. You can't really say that's a bad thing. So you're not normal. And Martha and I share a lot of this with you.
Well, we've spent most of our lifetime in aviation, as I'm sure that many of you have. And we've always owned and flown just a little bit more airplane than we could really quite afford, as I'm sure some of you probably have. And when we started doing the two-day ground school, the traveling two-day ground school, we stepped up fairly soon to a Cessna 340, a twin-engine pressurized Cessna, and flew that for 10 years. And it was really a marvelous airplane for us to travel the country and to do our ground schools and be really involved in aviation. We just couldn't imagine flying to a class to talk all about general aviation flying and doing it on an airliner. So we structured the business and the location on the classes so that we really almost had to fly ourselves there. But after 10 years flying the Cessna 340, we got this really bad aviation sickness. And I'm sure that some of y'all have it or have had it. And that is, we got this terrible need to smell jet fuel. A very expensive need. So we went out and we bought an old Cessna Citation, and people ask us all the time, well, was it a 1 or 2? Or, well, it was before they were doing numbers on it, and we called it a Citation 0 because it was the very first year they ever built it. And it was a great airplane for us, but in addition to being one of the very first business jets that was ever built. It was also about the slowest business jet ever built. And the jokes and the ridicule was just got to be terrible. People would call it a slowtation, they'd call it a mutation, they'd call it a crustacean. Controllers would call it a frustration. They were always moving us off to the side of the airway to let a real jet pass us on the airway. And some of you may remember that Beechcraft a long time ago used to run ads that said that the King Air flew at near jet speeds. Well, our Citation 500 was the near jet they were talking about. And it had a really unusual bird strike problem. I don't know if anyone knows what that bird strike problem was, but you want to tell them, John, what that bird strike problem was?
It got run down from the rear. So after years of flying this Citation and a decade of these jokes at our expense, and it was a John and Martha airplane, we decided we wanted to go out and get something faster. So we got the old Falcon 10 that we've now had for the last 18 years. And that old Falcon 10 was 150 knots faster than that Citation. And as you might imagine, the insurance company had grave misgivings about putting this mom and pop operation in that hot jet. So they said, look, John, Martha, in addition to your going out and getting simulator training and taking the full course of simulator training, we want to make sure that you do the entire thing all at one time and take the entire course and get yourself type rated in that Falcon. And we did. It was like 21 days. It was the hardest work we ever did as adults. I mean, we sweated bullets, about the hardest thing we ever did. But when we got done, we figured we must have done pretty well, because the instructor got us aside. He says, well, John, Martha, I've got wonderful news for you. I said, oh, that's fantastic. What's that? He says, well, you'll never have to worry about a mid-air collision in this airplane. And I said, that's wonderful. Why not? He says, you're so far behind this airplane, you won't even be involved. He says, you're going to come walking up to the crash site 15 minutes later and say, hey, what happened here?
You know, John was talking about our relationship earlier. John likes to think that our relationship exemplifies that old saying that behind every successful man stands a great woman.
Well, you got that right. That's exactly how I feel about it, Martha.
What he doesn't realize is the real truth is, in front of every great woman stands some guy without a clue who's blocking her view.
You know, when Martha and I went into this partnership, and that's what it's been for, we've been partners in business, partners in flying, partners in video, partners in making presentations. We decided we were going to be equal partners, and we have been, and so all of our flying, we have almost exactly each about 13,000 hours. We're just about equal in our flying time. And as I said earlier, Martha's just a little bit better pilot than I am. So we've had a great partnership. And one of the things I've really enjoyed is a lot of these awards we've gotten is the fact that we have been included together.
Yeah.
All right. Let's talk about the heart of what we're talking about, and that is.
Well, you've already talked about the fact that they're very special people, but what I also want to say is that what we'd like to try and do this afternoon, I guess it's evening for y'all on the East Coast now, is talk about some of the things that we have learned through the flying that we've done, 10 years of flying all around the country to go to our classes and other things, flying.
Part of what we've learned is that we've been talking to a lot of people, and we've learned from thinking about it and talking about it.
But we've got some specific risk management tools that we'd like to share with you this evening that hopefully will make your trips more fun and less stressful, and help make sure that your passengers will fly with you again. So what we're going to reveal this evening right here on Zoom is, first of all, the most important consideration in flying, and secondly, the most feared emergency in all of aviation.
Now, Martha and I are going to suggest that we ought to do better as a community in our risk management than we do. And I think one of the reasons that we haven't done as well as we could have is what we call the big lie. And a big lie is one you've been telling for so long and so many times that you believe it yourself, even though it isn't true. And the big lie in aviation is that the most dangerous part of the trip was the drive to the airport. And that is not true. It is true for the airlines, but it's not true for general aviation, because in a general aviation trip, you're 7 times more likely to be involved in a fatality per mile than you are in an automobile. You're 49 times more likely to be involved in a fatality in a general aviation airplane than you are in airlines. In fact, your fatality per mile rate in a general aviation airplane is on a par with motorcycles. So why is that? And the reason is, a lot of times pilots don't see this, the risk coming. They don't see the problems coming. And the reason is because they're sneaky in aviation, they're insidious, and they often catch pilots by surprise. And the problem is the risks in flying, they're hard to judge. It's hard to judge the probability of them and the consequences of them. If you want to fly a VFR trip in marginal VFR conditions, you might know it's risky, but you have no idea what the actual probability of having an accident is. But if you play Russian roulette and you hold a gun to your head, you know what the odds are. It's 1 out of 6. But in flying, who knows? So people who manage risk for a living tell us that if you that when the risks are hard to manage, it's hard to know the probability, it's hard to know the consequences, people underestimate the risks. So we in general aviation have been underestimating the risks for a long, long time. Now, the plain fact is that if the risks are left unmanaged, they are acceptable. And what I would like, did I say acceptable?
You did.
Unacceptable. So Gabe, can we do this? I would like to ask people to hold up their hand if something is true for them. Can we get people to do that? So here I'm going to ask you a question. And if the question is true for you, I would like you to hold up your hand, and then we're going to look around and see how many people have their hand up. How many people in here today know someone personally that was killed in a general aviation aircraft? If you know someone personally who was killed in a general aviation aircraft, please put up your hand, and we'll see how many hands we have. And Gabe, can you count those?
He's counting.
He's counting. It may take a long time.
Yeah, there's a lot. I'm already to about 13, 14. There's another, 21. Yeah, it's quite a few.
I'm going to say that normally when we do this, more than half the people in the room know someone personally who was killed in a general aviation aircraft. Now, and if you do it with flight instructors, it's about 80 or 90%. If you hang around general aviation long enough, eventually you're going to know someone who's killed in a general aviation airplane. And the fact is, folks, that is unacceptable. And so, Martha?
We need to do something about it. Part of our problem is that the way that risk management has been taught and practiced in general aviation generally is flawed. And the reason I say that is because if you look at the accidents in general aviation, about 85% of those accidents are caused by a failure in risk management. Not by a problem with the airplane, but by a failure in risk management by the pilot. And of course, what does most of our flight training focus on? It focuses on skill. That's not what's killing people. When students leave flight training, the accident rate jumps by almost 50%. And what that says to us, the accident rate per 100,000 hours in student training is about 5.8, and for a new private pilot, it goes up to about 8.5. What that says to us is that as flight instructors, we're doing a pretty good job of managing the risks during flight instruction and the risk of flight instruction itself. What we're not doing nearly as good a job as we should and we could is passing on more of our own risk management ability to our learning pilots, so that once they go out on their own, they don't have this high accident rate. The way that generally risk management is taught in aviation is by telling stories and passing along rules and making up sayings. And those are all good things to do. The sayings, for instance, most people know the saying that the only time you can have too much fuel in an airplane is when what?
It's on fire.
When you're on fire. The two most useless things in aviation are the runway above you, the runway behind you, and the altitude above you. Got to keep those straight.
Yeah,
That
right.
gets you into problems. Or it's a lot better to be on the ground wishing you were up in the air than up in the air really wanting to be down on the ground right now. They're all great sayings, but they're not enough because they're not a system for managing the risks.
You know, the way a lot of pilots become what you would call experienced is the way Martha and I became experienced, is you get your pilot certificate and you go out and try something. And you expose yourself to some risk and you say, well, how did it do? And if it was not scary, you place it in the acceptable category, but you may have just been lucky. And the more times you get away with it, the more acceptable it becomes. But if it does scare you, on the other hand, you say, wow, I'm not going to do that again. And you add that thing that scared you to a long list of things that you won't do again. But the problem is, and you say to yourself, I'm not going to do that again. And that's what you call learning by experience. And that's how you become experienced. And if you don't run out of luck, then you become experienced. But the problem is, experience is a hard teacher. She gives a test first and the lesson comes afterwards. And many pilots and their passengers don't live to get the lesson. And the problem is, even if you do this, it doesn't prepare you for unanticipated lists. Even if you get a big, long list of things you won't do anymore, if you haven't scared yourself doing that specifically or haven't even thought about it.
And live through it.
You had to scare yourself, live through it. But it doesn't help you with something you haven't thought of. And so it doesn't help you for unanticipated risks. So due to the characteristics of how this works, we all have to be proactive, not reactive. Well, Martha and I, we're flying like this, and we scared ourselves a lot until finally we had an accident. And as a result of that accident, we changed. We became what we call born again pilots. We changed everything we do about flying. And our attitude towards risk management towards flying. So the accident happened before we had our Cessna 340, when we had a Cessna 210, and we were traveling around the country doing these 2-day ground schools. And this particular trip was one from San Diego, California to Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And we went across the Rockies, and then it was a turbo 210, so it flew high very well, and got on the opposite side and landed at La Junta, Colorado. We filled it up with gas. We got a weather briefing, and what we learned from the weather briefing is that when we arrived in the Sioux Falls area, there was going to be about 3 miles visibility and a 1,000-foot ceiling. And it was, you know, it was a VFR. We were instrument rated. We were flying all the time. Our instruments we were very current at it. So that didn't worry us a lot. So we took off without being concerned at all, heading towards Sioux Falls. And we took off and got above an overcast. And in order to not have to be talking all the time on the radio, we canceled IFR and flew VFR on top and headed out towards Sioux Falls. And as we're flying along on our way towards Sioux Falls, I look over there and I said, son of a gun, look at that. Our generator quit working. Well, right off, this is a no-brainer. We should have just simply gotten back down on the ground and got the generator fixed. But we said, and by the way, this was before the area of handheld radios and GPSs. So we had neither a radio nor a GPS. We had nothing, no communication and no navigation except for dead reckoning. And we said, well, we can hold a heading. So we'll just hold a heading for about, we'll say about 3 hours and hold that heading, keep track of the time. And when we think we're in the vicinity of Sioux Falls, we'll turn the battery back on, turn the electrical system on, and by the way, when we got there, we were supposed to have about a 1,000-foot ceiling and 3 miles visibility, so we'll let ourselves down through that and go find our airport, and we'll get our generator fixed while we're teaching the ground school, and it'll all be great. So we thought, well, that's a great idea, so let's do that. So we turned on the electrical system, and what did we get? What do you think we got? Absolutely nothing. The battery was stone cold dead. Well, holy mackerel, we're in trouble now. We don't know where we are.
Not exactly.
No. We have a good idea, but not exactly. And so this just scared the daylights out of me, just scared the devil out of me. And so I said, well, I don't want to go down through the clouds. Let's figure something else out. And so Martha and I are working on our alternatives, and we said, well, there was a place on our weather briefing, which, by the way, we weren't smart enough to have written down. There was a place on our weather briefing where they had like 5,000-foot ceiling and 5 miles visibility. Where was that? And neither one of us could remember where that was. We're just hanging up there, burning up fuel. And so Martha says to me, John, you got to go down. I said, oh, well, Martha, I don't want to go down. She said, well, you need to go down. So we go into the clouds, and immediately, as soon as we get about 10,000 feet, we get into the clouds and wham, ice all over the airplane. Now, if you're in icing conditions and you do not have an electrical system, what else do you not have? Pitot heat. So the airspeed indicator goes 90, 80, 70, 60, and you believe in it. You think, wow, look at that airspeed go away, and you think it's true until it goes backwards. So you know the plane isn't going backwards. So we continued on down, and we got to within what we thought. Now we didn't know exactly where we were. We didn't know exactly how high the terrain was.
We didn't have an altimeter setting for the last few hours.
Well, it might have been about 3 hours since we had a current reported altimeter setting. But we continued down until we thought we were 100 feet above the ground and never saw the ground. Holy mackerel. I put the power in, and we go up through the clouds, and we get on top. And now I am absolutely scared to death. And Martha says to me, John, you've got to go back down. I said, Martha, I don't want to go back down. If we go back down there, the way this is going to end is we're going to hit something. We'll hit a silo, a TV antenna, a tower. Who knows what we'll hit? But the way this is going to end is we're going to hit something. And while we're having this argument, and finally I said, I've got it. Let's just follow another airplane, find another airplane, follow it to an airport. She says, John, that's not going to work. You got to go down now. So while we're having this argument, the sun slowly sets below the horizon. And Martha says to me, John, would you rather do it now or in the dark? And I hate it when she thinks that way. So we start back down again and begin to pick up our third load of ice. And once again, we continue down until we think we're 100 feet above the ground and still do not see the ground. And Martha says to me, John, you got to go back up again. I said, Martha, we can't go back up again. There's nothing up there for us. We're just going to run out of gas up there. We've got to keep on going down. So I said, I don't care where we are, we're going to land right here. So I just simply pulled the power off and we continued down. We broke out of the clouds, and right in front of me, I saw a cornfield, and I said, I'm landing right there. And Martha says to me, John, you can't land there. I said, why can't I land there? She says, well, I see cars on that road over there, and they got their lights on, but I eventually was going to land on that road. She says, you can't land on that road. And the problem was there were cars coming and going. I said, well, so therefore I'm there. So, okay, in that case, I'll pull over here. I guess I screwed up the story, but we're going to get there. And so
we got to the cornfield eventually.
And we did get to the cornfield. I pulled the power off, and I had the landing gear down. And what had been going on, by the way, is they had a freezing rain ice storm, and they had about 18 inches of snow on the ground and about 1.5 inches crust of ice on top of that. So when we touched down, we just simply, at that moment, I began my all-time record short field landing. The airplane just completely stopped, went up over onto its nose, and hovered there for a little bit, and finally came back down, then went down and hit the wing on the ground. And Martha says to me, first thing she says is, John, I'm okay, I'm okay. I hit my head, I hit my nose on the panel of the aircraft, but I'm okay. And I look up and I saw a great big hole in the windshield ahead of us. And I said, the hell, you're okay? Your head went through the windshield. She says, no, I'm okay. I hit my nose on the panel of the aircraft. I've got a bloody nose, but I'm okay. And I reached over there and I felt behind her, and there was blood all the way down her back. And I said, well, hell, you've got something a lot more serious than a bloody nose. But I said, why don't we carry on this conversation outside the aircraft? So I opened the door and I got out in front of the aircraft. And when I got in front, I saw this big long stream of junk, rags, wrenches, tools, all out in front of the aircraft. And I thought, I'll be darned, look at that. Somebody landed here before we did. Then I got around to the right side of the aircraft and I opened the door. And at that moment, I realized for the first time in my life how incredibly stupid allegedly bright people can be. Because when I opened that door, I saw that Martha's blood was sprayed over every ounce of the inside of that aircraft. And what had happened, if you're familiar with the Cessna 210, the baggage is behind the pilots, and the landing gear retracts rearward. So they have the baggage kind of up on a shelf. And so we had a tool kit and all of our baggage there, and the tool kit went through the windshield of the aircraft. We, of course, weren't smart enough to tie it down. And so all of that went through the front of the aircraft and out the front of the aircraft. And so when I opened that door, I thought, you idiot, you absolute, complete idiot. How dare you take such a risk with the most precious thing in the world, all over the fact that you didn't want to take the time to land and get that generator repaired. And when the insurance company brought a truck in there, first thing they did is take the wings off the airplane, take it into a hangar. And the very first thing they did when they got in the hangar is check to see what was wrong with the generator. And all that was wrong with that generator is that a single wire had become detached. And because we didn't want to take the time to land and reattach that single wire, we put everything in our lives that was precious to us at risk. But we did become born-again pilots, and we changed everything about our flying from that moment on.
Well, you can tell by listening to this story that physical skill with the airplane was not the issue with that accident. The problem was our absolute, total, complete lack of risk management. Because of that accident and some other incidents, some of which we're going to talk about this evening, but some of which I don't think we will, because you never know when the FAA might be zooming in on a call. We developed some risk management tools that, as I said at the beginning, we want to share with you this evening, and hope that you find them to be helpful in your own flying. And first of all, the idea is to conduct risk surveillance. Look for risk when you're thinking about a flight or during a flight. Think of it as the same way as a mechanic looks for defects when you've taken your airplane into them for an annual. You may have even flown the airplane to a different airport, and as far as you're concerned, that's in pretty good shape. But the first thing that the mechanic does when they get the airplane is they pull it out, a checklist, and they start going down that checklist and surveilling the aircraft, looking for defects that need to be fixed, so that aircraft will hopefully be safe for another year. So we would ask for you to conduct risk management surveillance. And here's some tools that you can use. When you're planning the flight before takeoff, you can pave your way to a safe flight. And PAVE stands for the pilot, the aircraft, the environment, and external pressures. And by paving your way, what we're talking about, each one of these is a category, if you will, of hazards. Take a look at the flight that you're planning, because you're doing this before takeoff, and figure out what hazards, if any, exist in these 4 different categories, and put them in there, and then think about them. And we're not talking about, this is your tool for a go, no-go decision. We're talking about, this is your tool for a modify your flight decision as the most likely outcome. Can you change something about your flight that will reduce the risk and make it a more fun flight as well as a safer flight? So the P in PAVE stands for the pilot.
And the pilot is a big risk factor. And when you're thinking about the pilot, the things you want to think about are, is this the right pilot? And is this the right time for this pilot for this flight? And you start off with the physical condition of the pilot, and the FAA likes to use what they call the I'm safe checklist. You think about illness, medication, stress, alcohol, fatigue, and food. A lot of times people will work all day and then leave in the evening on a trip without having had any food. And also ease for motion. If you're mad at the world, flying an airplane is probably not the way to work it out. So think about what's your physical and mental condition for this flight, and at the same time also think about, back on the pilot, are you rated for this aircraft? Are you equipped for it? Are you current in this aircraft? Are you the pilot to be flying this airplane? If we're going to fly it at night, are you ready to fly the airplane at night? Are you ready to fly? And for instruments, are you current on instruments? And then the next thing to think about is the aircraft. And every aircraft has its limitations. And so, is this the right aircraft for this trip? And all of those limitations include, among them, is density altitude. And density altitude is a risk factor in every airplane, every flight. Martha and I one time discovered this concept of density altitude personally for ourselves when we were on a trip from San Diego up to Death Valley, California. And we had another couple with us. We had a Cherokee 140 at that time, and the Cherokee had what they called it was a 2+2. They didn't want you to think of it as a 4-place airplane. And you normally put luggage in the back seat, but if you didn't have any luggage, you could snap some seats in the back seat and carry some passengers with you. So we had another couple with us on this trip up to Death Valley, California. And we're not at that time very experienced in our cross-country flying. And all of a sudden, when we're flying along east of the Sierra Nevada mountains, there's the Owens Valley, and there's a desert down there. And we're flying above that desert, and all of a sudden it occurs to me, hey, wait a minute. if we get to Death Valley and they don't sell fuel there, we won't be able to go anywhere else. We better land short and get some fuel. So we looked down on the map, and about a 4,000 feet elevation down underneath us is this airport in the desert called Lone Pine. So I decided it'd be a great idea to land there at Lone Pine. So we land at Lone Pine and we taxi up and we open the door and we realize, holy mackerel, it's really hot here. It's about 110 degrees. And this old codger walks up to us, and as he gets near, I said to him, top it off. And he gives me a long, slow look, and he says, you mean just fill it up to those tabs there, don't you, sir? He's looking at us, 4 people in the aircraft. And I said, did I stutter? I said, top it off. He says, okay. So he gets the hose out and fills that airplane completely to the tops. Meanwhile, we go in, get something to drink, go to the bathroom, and we get out, and we're getting ready for a takeoff. And so we get everybody loaded in the airplane and get ready for the takeoff. Now, you should know you're doing something wrong if when you get ready for a takeoff, it draws a crowd. People just lined up in front of the building. They were getting ready to watch this takeoff because they knew it was going to be one very interesting takeoff. So we get in the airplane, load all 4 of us in, taxi out to the end of the runway. I don't know why I'm always the pilot for this stuff.
I wonder where that is.
I don't know. So I put the power in, and the wheels just slowly start rolling, and we go the whole length of that runway, and we get to the other end, and I rotate because it seemed to be the thing to do. And we have a red stall warning light comes on, and that light is blinking in our eyes while we're climbing up. I swear that we went around trees for 5 miles. And that airplane finally started climbing away, and I looked back to see how our passengers were doing. All I could see were 4 big silver dollars staring back at us. They were scared to death. That couple never did fly with us again, but for the first time in my life, on June 26th in the afternoon in Owens Valley, California, Lone Pine, and the year was about 1971. For the first time in my life, I fully understood the concept of density altitude.
The V in the PAVE checklist is for the environment. A little bit tortured for environment, but we've got to have those aviation acronyms. We can't do anything without them. The environment covers a lot of things. What kind of airspace are you flying in? Are you going to be comfortable, or should you do some flight training before you go into, for instance, a really busy Class Bravo airspace area? Are you going to be flying over the mountains? Are you going to be flying across an ocean, or for instance, the Gulf of Mexico? Are you comfortable in that environment? Do you have the right personal tools in order to handle it? Day versus night is an important part of the environment. The weather's smoother at night generally, a lot calmer, and it's beautiful, but you can't see nearly as well, and that affects the accident rate. So the accident rate on day versus night cross countries, about 10% of them are done at night, but about 50% of the fatalities happen at night. One of the aspects of the weather, of the environment, is the weather. And that's what John and I flunked on, if you will, when we were on our trip in the 210 to Sioux Falls. We did get an updated weather briefing with an area that could have been a VFR alternate to us. It was within range, we figured out later on, but we didn't write the information down, so we didn't have a way to remember it. And that's one of the things that's really nice about the iPads and other tablets that you can take into the cockpit. And if you've got something that gives you ADS-B, you can have all kinds of information on there, and also take the flight logs from where you from when you took off, and they persist on the on the iPad or the tablet, so that you've got a lot more information available to you than we used to have.
With all of these risk factors, but especially one with the what we call the environment, is you don't necessarily have to cancel the trip, but you can modify the trip. You can change the airport you're going to land at. You can change the route you're going to have.
Change the time of day that you're going to go. Maybe go a day earlier or a day later, depending on the nature of the trip. But think about alternatives, things that you can modify. Maybe it needs to be a different airplane that you take in order to meet the environment that you're going to be working in.
Now, coming up is the E, which stands for external pressures. And by that, it's external / internal pressures. It's the things that would make you continue when you shouldn't. And you can manage these very well. Well, one of them is having people waiting for you at the airport. You can not wanting to stay overnight. So Martha and I try and manage these pressures that would make you continue when you shouldn't. But in one of those pressures we talked about earlier is your own goal-oriented behavior, that you're used to completing what you set out to do. And so the external pressures are the risk factor that lets you ignore all the other risk factors. And go ahead.
Some of the things that John and I use to help take those external pressures off is if we're just going out for $100 hamburger, we'll throw a little overnight bag in the back of the airplane. So John wears contacts, he'll have contact fluid, and he'll have a contact case, and we'll have any medications that we need. And if we're, so that way, if something goes wrong with the airplane, we can spend the night if we need to, but there's no pressure on us to get back that day to avoid an overnight stay. If we're going to be seeing someone, we try to have them wait until we land, and we'll call them and have them come to the airport at that point. And in the meantime, we can be putting the airplane to bed and cleaning it up and getting it ready for the trip home. Or we'll get a rental car or something like that, so that we're not worried that somebody's going to be there waiting for us. And that lets us, if we need to, make a diversion so the trip gets longer, but they still aren't going to worry. Or maybe we land for fuel and fix it that way. So one of the important things then is, in these days of cell phones, is to make sure that you have the cell phone of anyone who is expecting you where you're going to be going, so that if you do have to do a diversion or land for fuel, you've got a way to get a hold of them, and having them waiting for you at the airport isn't something then that will be pressuring you.
So the trick to all of this is you want to try and, what we try and do is set ourselves up for success. I mean, don't get ourselves into a bind where we're feeling pressure. And I think if you wanted to boil this talk down into something that had any kind of substance to it, finally, it would be just manage yourself and manage your emotions so that you don't feel pressured, you don't allow yourself to pressure yourself. And the reason people have accidents is their emotions and their failure to manage themselves and the failure to manage the risks that they're into. So I think this is the substance of what we're trying to figure out to say to you.
Right. Now, this is a checklist to use when you're planning the trip to...
This being the PAVE checklist.
The PAVE checklist, to modify things in advance if you need to. How about once you're airborne? While you're airborne, you can use what we call the C-CARE checklist or risk management attention scan to manage risk. And C-CARE stands for changes. The second C is consequences, then alternatives, reality, and external pressures. And basically what you do is control of the aircraft is the centerpiece of everything you're doing, but you spoke out. at appropriate times to think about what are the consequences of the changes that are happening? What does that mean my alternatives are now? What is my new reality if things are changing? And are my external pressures pushing on me to make me want to do something that I really shouldn't be doing? Continue the flight in worsting weather, or with lower fuel, or with an airplane that's not working quite right. So you spoke out to those, and the first issue is the consequences that comes about because of changes.
Now, as soon as you get airborne, all the things you thought about and paid start changing, because flying is a dynamic thing. You're flying an airplane, it's getting lower on fuel, it's flying over changing terrain, it's getting later in the day, and flown by a pilot who's getting more fatigued. So everything that you managed to begin with starts changing, and what you want to do is start thinking through the consequences of those changes. Let's assume that you get airborne, and just after you get airborne, you look over your GPS and see your ground speeds are like 20 knots slower than you thought it was going to be. Whoa, look at that, my ground speed's 20 knots slower. And I'll ask, you're going to be my class here.
Oh, okay.
Normally, if your ground speed is lower than you thought it was going to be, what's the cause of that?
Well, it's the wind.
Okay, the wind is different than you thought it was going to be. And so if you think about it, and typically you're going to be later than you thought you were going to be. So now think about this. Now you're in an airplane that's going to arrive lower on fuel, with a pilot who's fatigued and feeling pressured. And by the way, the instant you feel that you're in a hurry and that you're in a rush, that's an external pressure on you. That's a pressure on you. So now
that's a red flag.
It's a red flag. As soon as you feel I'm in a hurry or I need to hurry up, that's a red flag that you need to be careful of that. Okay. So all of these change, and probably what the wind, by the way, guides the pressure patterns in front. So the weather is probably going to change, and it's probably going to be worse than you anticipated.
Different than you expected, and as you say, probably worse.
Now when you took off, you had a huge circle of alternatives. I'm trying to make a huge circle here, but it gets off screen. But you had a huge circle of alternatives, and you had enough fuel to do when you take off, at the time of takeoff, you have enough fuel to do your entire trip, plus your reserve in all directions. So you start off with a huge circle of alternatives. And as you fly along, your circle of alternatives gets smaller and smaller and smaller, until at the end of the trip, your circle of alternatives is only equal to your reserve fuel in all directions. So the most important consideration in all of aviation is always have alternatives. So if you find yourself that your alternatives are getting fewer and you don't like the consequences of your changes, it becomes a no-brainer to land and re-expand your circle of alternatives. And that way you start fresh with a brand new huge circle of alternatives. So the most important consideration in all of aviation is always have alternatives.
And fuel, and therefore time, is one of the biggest things that gives you alternatives. And as John says, it becomes a no-brainer to land and refuel, and that hugely expands your circle of alternatives and gives you options. And it could be alternatives not just for fuel or for weather. It could be a destination runway closed, of all kinds of things.
Now, sometimes you see an aircraft accident and you think, what in the world was that guy thinking? Why did he continue? And because he didn't like the facts that he had. He didn't like the situation, so he denied reality. So the R here is deal with things as they really are, not as you plan them to be. And why would people deny reality when they're flying an airplane? Because they are, like all of us, goal-oriented people, and you don't want anything that's going to prevent you from doing what you want to do. So therefore, you deny your reality. You know, Martha and I had a generator quit working. So what did we do? Kept right on going as if that hadn't happened. We actually denied the reality of that failed generator. A lot of times people continue in weather that they're not going to be able to get through in, but they continue because they don't like what it's telling them. So they deny it. So deal with things as they are, as they really are, not just as you planned them to be.
So what do you think the biggest cause of cross-country fatalities in general aviation is? The biggest cause is continued VFR into worsening weather condition. Now, do you think people take off and deliberately fly in weather that they know ahead of time is going to kill them? Of course they don't, but they've got a goal. And the weather was forecast to be good enough for them to at least take off in, and then it gets worse. The weather keeps getting worse, and they keep denying reality. They keep denying the changes because they're very goal-oriented. So reality means when things change, you have to change your plan. And that leads us right back to the E again for external and internal pressures. And don't let them make you ignore the risks that in other categories that are developing because of the changes that are going on. That's exactly what happened to us on this ground school class where we were going to in Sioux Falls. We ignored the mechanical problem with the airplane because we had a goal of getting to Sioux Falls in time to be able to do the class the next day. We had money riding on the line. We had people we did not want to let down, and we let that external pressure very nearly kill us.
So let me give you a standard. If you're about to do something and you want to ask yourself, is this a wise thing to do? Let me give you a question you should ask yourself, and you'll know when you ask yourself this question, you'll know immediately whether or not it's something that you should do. And here's what I'm suggesting. Ask yourself, would I do this, what I'm about to do, if I had 100 people in the airplane behind me? Well, if you had if you say, well, no, I'd never do that with 100 people behind me, well, then why would you do it with the most precious people in your world, in your world, yourself and your family and the people you care about? So if you wouldn't take that risk with 100 people, then why in the world would you take it with the most precious people in your life? So the moral is, don't take risks with just your family and friends that you wouldn't do with 100 people on board behind you. All right, this, by the way, is the GA fatal accident rate. It's fatalities per 100,000 hours. And it appears to be coming down. If you look at from about, what is it, about 2014 on, the accident rate has started coming down. And I think that is because we are now changing the vocabulary in aviation, and we've started talking about risks, and we've talked about risk management, and risk management is part of the airman certification standards. When we create a new pilot these days, the evaluator expects that new pilot to be able to get into the scenario they're in and evaluate the risks and know how to identify and mitigate those risks. And because now for the last 5-6 years, we have started talking about risks and how to identify and mitigate those risks, and we're requiring pilots to be able to evaluate risks and mitigate them. For the very first time, we used to only evaluate people on skills. Now we're evaluating with standards for knowledge and standards for risk management. And I think as a result, we're seeing this inflection in the rate, and that's huge. That's many, many lives. So it's a very important thing, and I'm really thrilled to see.
Now, we made some promises to you at the beginning of this, and the first one was to cover the most important consideration in aviation. And John gave us that just a little bit ago. And John, what did you say that
I
was?
said the most important consideration in all of flying was always have an alternative.
Always have
Did I
alternatives.
do good?
You did
Did you remember
good.
that? Okay.
You
all right,
did good.
All right.
So remember to pave your way to a safe flight. When you're planning a flight, put risks and hazards into these different categories: the pilot, the aircraft, the environment, and external pressures, and figure out if you need to modify the trip somehow in order to reduce the risk. And once you're airborne, use CCARE to manage the risk of the changes that are happening. So it stands for changes, which result in new consequences, new alternatives, a revised reality, and again, pay attention to those external pressures.
Well, Martha, that wraps up all our promises.
Well, John, you've forgotten the other one that we talked about. We said we were going to cover the most feared emergency in all of flying.
You're right. I did say we're going to cover the most feared emergency in all of flying. And what is that, Martha?
Well, the most feared emergency is a runaway Hobbs meter.
Especially if it's rental air. Folks, we'd like to make a special wish for you. Keep the pointy end forward, the dirty side down, and by all means, please.
Stay out of the trees.
Thanks for putting up with us for a long evening, folks.
Thank you both so much. That was fantastic. Just incredible stories, and that was
Some of them
just
are
amazing.
true, too. That's the scary part.
I got to tell you, here in Northern Virginia, we were getting a massive storm, so a few people had to drop off. So hopefully they're coming back online. But that was amazing. Thank you, John and Martha, so much. I was scrolling through the chat, and if you guys are okay with it, maybe we could answer some questions for the next few minutes.
Yeah, you're our moderator, aren't you?
I'll try to be.
All right. Try and be moderate about it.
So let's see. Right. I don't really have much in the chat per se. If anybody is online that would like to unmute themselves and ask a question directly, I'd love for you to do so. Now would be the time to go for it.
I'm sorry. I have a question. First, I want to thank you both for the great material that we use for online training. That was really, for the last 3 years, I'm just using King School stuff. So thank you very much for that.
Well, I hope we're working well together.
My question is, when you have a dramatic experience like this and you land in a cornfield, how do you mentally recover for something like this and you fly again?
Well, I'll tell you how Martha mentally recovered.
I taught the ground school class the next day.
Yeah, she had been to the hospital and they shaved the top of her head, and she taught the ground school class with a shaved head. I was very, very shaken up by it, but Martha kept going, and she had the lieutenant governor of the state in the class that day. Was that Harvey Woman? It was, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm, that's right.
And this was in South Dakota. And
one of the more spectacular ways to make acquaintances.
you know, the interesting thing about South Dakota is they have a tradition of flying governors, and we've taught 2 of their governors. It's just that it's part of the South Dakota's tradition is that their governors fly.
Wow.
No, okay, I didn't really answer the question. I was really shaken up, and I'm still bothered today. I'll tell you, there's another story. I'll try and keep it down. That really bothered me a lot is that I had someone in one of my classrooms who was both a physician and an Episcopalian priest, and they would go out and come back and ask me to repeat what they've just been. Yeah, leave the classroom and then come back and say, well, could you cover what I missed? Well, no, you were gone an hour and I have 70 people in here. I can't do that. So when the FAA came, I said to the FAA came to give the test, and I took the guy to coffee afterwards, and I said, Dell, You need to talk. Thank you, Martha. You need to talk to Dr. Parsons. I think he's going to kill himself in an airplane. And Dell says, I can't just grab some guy out of your class and give him a lecture just because you say I should. And I said, well, if you don't, he's going to kill himself. And he said, well, why don't you go talk to him? I said, well, I'm just a traveling ground instructor. He's not going to listen to me. So neither one of us talked to him. And about 2 weeks later, the phone rang, and it's the FAA inspector, Dell Randall. He says, Dell, John, I thought you, oh, no, this is Dell. Dr. Parsons is dead. And so it had only taken 2 weeks for that guy to kill himself. And he killed himself by this goal-oriented behavior. He was on a solo cross country and continued in bad weather. And he got into the clouds, and he's on the flight service station, and they say, what do you see? And he says, well, I see mountains and I see trees, and there's clouds in the trees. And he went back and got in the same trees and got killed on the way back home. And he had, because he had to get back for a talk. They said, come in, have some coffee. Let's talk about this, because it scared everybody, including the flight service station. And so he says, no, I got to give a speech. I got to keep going. So he killed himself in those mountains. He never gave the speech, for what it's worth. That really bothered me. That bothered me as much as anything in all of aviation, because I saw it coming and I didn't stop it. And I thought about quitting teaching. I didn't want to be in an activity that was causing people to kill themselves. And in general aviation, there are a lot of people who do. And so I made the commitment to myself. I am never, ever again going to let someone put such a guilt trip on me. That guilt trip just stayed with me and deeply, profoundly bothered me. Then later on, I began to realize that when we got into video, that I had an opportunity to maybe influence the entire aviation community. And I decided that I was not going to allow the aviation community to put me into a guilt trip. And that's why we're talking tonight. That Martha and I got started doing these kinds of talks. And I was one of the big proponents to getting risk management in the airman certification standards. And I've been working on that for 8 years. I've been going to Washington 4 times a year for the last 8 years, and I've pushed hard on it. But that's the reason that one person's death deeply bothered me, and that actually bothered me more than our own accident. Mm-hmm. But I was very scared from our own accident. But that death that really got to me. I'm sorry. Did I answer your question? I shut everybody up, didn't I?
Thank you.
Here from Ryan Crawford. What was the moment John and Martha realized that this home video business was really taking off? Interestingly enough, we had been teaching the 2-day ground schools for 10 years, and John's uncle kept pushing us to put it on video, the course on video. And we kept telling him, well, that just goes to show you don't understand our business, because we really need to be there personally in order to get the job done.
Our dynamic personalities in the room, or it won't work. And he says, well, I don't know how you know that if you haven't tried it. So we put the course on video, and as you know, it's sold. And Martha and I had been bankrupt in a business before that, and I grew up in a business that was just struggled for decades, and so I have never really truly believed a business could work. I never understood that concept. So when these courses sold, we were the most surprised people in the world.
It's interesting, because with the videos, we first started out using them in our own classes so that we wouldn't get as tired, and then the videos let us hire some teams of instructors who went out and used the videos with classes, and then were there to run the class and answer questions and so on. Then we started selling the videos to flight instructors so that in the parts of the country where we didn't travel, because in San Diego, you're kind of in a corner of the country, we could still sell courses. And one year, when we first started selling the video courses to instructors for them to use to put on classes, we went to AirVenture and had a booth, and we were selling the flight instructor courses this was in 1983, 4.
We sold them for $500.
Which was a lot of money.
People were coming and bellying up to the counter and buying them for their personal use.
And that's one of the wonderful things, and what a sadness for aviation that neither Sun and Fun nor AirVenture happened this year, because at AirVenture with that booth and the ability to talk to the people personally, casually that were coming up and talk about the courses, what we found out was that only a very tiny percentage of the people that bought courses there at AirVenture were buying them to teach with. They were buying them for their own personal use. And so we made some revisions in how we packaged the tapes. It was all still the same content, but we packaged them a little bit differently and priced them such that we thought it would be a good deal for individuals, and put our very first black and white ad in
Plane and Pilot.
Private Pilot magazine, and that's when it started. Yeah, and it just kept trucking along.
People have asked us, now you've been in this business for 45 years, how is it you're still eating regularly?
That surprises me. I haven't figured that out yet.
And the answer is, I tell them there's two things. First of all, we have always solicited feedback from our customers who've been very responsive to it. And so we had postcards, now we have electronic postcards, and the other thing is we distribute that feedback every single, if you make a complaint to King Schools, it goes to every single employee in the company. And if you make a complaint about one of our FERCs, the Flight Instructor Refresher courses, we send it to the FAA. It goes to them right at the same time it goes to us, because we think that when people know what the complaints are and are responsive to them, that's our hope for fixing them. So being responsive to customer complaints is one of the rules. The other rule is we've kept track with, one of the reasons we're still eating regularly is we keep track of keep up to date with the technology. And so we've gone from VHS to beta to CD to DVD to now being driven by a computer and online, and all of that's changed through the years. And we're just in a just kind of just keeping, we're on a treadmill. Yeah, we're on a treadmill keeping up with technology. And the other thing is Martha and I became students. We learned how to market. Our first marketing attempts were very, very crude.
Here's a question I'd enjoy answering from James Dingle. He says, what caused you to make the leap into the Falcon 10? The Falcon 10 has 50% more range than the Citation had, and it's 50% faster than the Citation was. And what pilot doesn't have the need for speed?
You don't want to go farther and faster. Who doesn't want to do that? The other thing that surprised me, the Falcon 10 requires 2 pilots, and by golly, it needs 2 pilots. You're busy in that airplane, and I had not anticipated that. It's harder. It's a lot harder to fly than the Citation, isn't it?
But that's fun.
Yeah, but
that's why aviation in general is fun, is because it's challenging.
Yeah.
It demands a lot from you, emotionally, intellectually, physically, a very challenging time.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I've got a private message here asking, is there anything that the FAA should focus less on and more on for the PPL certification?
Well, part of what John's working group helped them make some changes on is they finally quit asking about ADF on the private pilot, and they are adding some questions on GPS. Now we can just hope that they ask reasonable questions on GPS.
I'm going to surprise you. What I'm going to say that's going to be surprising is I'm very impressed with the caliber of people that I've been working with the FAA and the Airman Certification Standards Working Group. And I think that they are trying very, very hard to do what's right. I made a complaint about ADFs being asked, and they were asking. What started this whole working group in part is I felt that one of the things when we were teaching two-day ground schools, we were traveling around, and it would not be uncommon for us to show up back at a city, and we had a kind of a circuit of cities. And someone would say, hey, did you hear about Bill? And I said, no, what happened, Bill? Well, he got killed in an airplane accident. And what we were finding is that we were having to deal with trivial things those days on the written test. They used to do double interpolations, whether you could take off and would it be take, and the difference would be 25 feet. And in my view, if you're calculating the takeoff distance required, and it comes in between two numbers, pick the more conservative number. You don't do an interpolation. And I thought they were training pilots to do the wrong thing. They should have trained pilots to take a more conservative approach. And so all the way through, the FAA was asking trivial, picky questions. And the reason they were is that they wanted a bell-shaped curve. In order to get a bell-shaped curve, they had to have people miss a certain number of questions. They didn't want to ask questions that no one's going to miss. Well, if you ask a really good question that it's good common sense and no one's going to miss it, that's a good thing. But the FAA wanted, they had psychometricians, they wanted to have that bell-shaped curve. And one of the things that we got changed in these 9 years working with the FAA is they no longer ask trivial, tricky questions. I wouldn't say no longer. They're trying very hard to not ask trivial, tricky questions. And they used to ask questions that
well, on the instrument, for instance, they used to ask, they finally, when they first got into doing GPS questions and the instrument knowledge test, their favorite GPS question was, how many satellites are there in the system?
Who cares? It'll tell you if you don't have enough.
The answer is enough that your machine tells you, your system tells you that it's okay. What they should have been asking, and they're doing a much better job at now, is what do you do if you get a RAIM alert, or what do you do, or what kind of messages do you get on your WASP GPS?
What does it mean, and how do you respond if you can't do an LPV, for instance?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But you have to remember, John, that these are the people, if you will, that volunteered for change. In
that group?
In the working group. They held their hands up and said, I would like to help change things. But they are.
But we've been meeting
9 years?
In 9 years, 4 times a year, and coming back in that group. And I have had a wonderful experience of, if there was anything that I wanted to complain about, I had people to say it to, and which changed it. On the ADF thing, I was saying, you're asking tricky, trivial questions about ADFs, and where the answer is what's the heading of the aircraft. They ask you, see if I can get this right. If your relative is a backwards ADF question, and nobody needs to do a backwards ADF question when they're flying an airplane, and they were asking that. So in any event, next time I came back, and the guy says, well, we're not going to ask any more ADF questions. I said, what? not just tricky, trivial questions. They're just not going to ask them anymore because the ADF is no longer an important part of the navigation system in the country, and that's probably true. But I did not expect that. But we're not going to ask anymore. Whoa! All I asked is quit asking tricky ones. Well, we got into it. We decided we don't need to ask those anymore. So I think that I've seen a big improvement in the quality of what. So if you got something you think that the FAA should quit asking, let me know, because I've got the voice and I can talk to them about it. So who asked
any idea what you're inviting?
I don't mind that. I don't mind. But if you see stupid questions, let me know, because I've got the venue to talk to them about it. So.
We've got thank you for that, and we've got a question from Ray. Ray, you're unmuted at this point, I believe.
I am. Thank you, and good evening,
Hello,
John and Martha. It's been a while since the last time we saw each other, but I like the color of your shirt, by the way, John. Very nice. Anyway, when I started as a flight instructor only a few years ago on the south side of Leesburg Airport, I ended up with this little mom and pop flight instructor business, and I was mostly.
Well, we know what mom and pop is like, Ray.
Yeah, there you go. And it was only a pop at that point in time. And there was more talking about flying and drinking coffee. And there was a guy who was retired as an airline pilot, and he always added to the conversation what would go right, what would go wrong. It was amazing what the man had stories had to tell. But when there was nobody there, I was still there, because you have to be there for the potential student to walk in, even if it was snowing. So I've had many hours watching your tapes.
I'm so sorry.
No, it was pretty good. But the only thing really what it came down to is what both of you do unbelievably is how to make something that's complicated, make it sound so easy. And I hope that I can do some of that when I work with my students, because I really felt that I was almost ready to be a flight engineer on 727 after watching all 3 tapes. The only problem was there were 4. So I never got the reel. So I hope if you still have a VHS tape at 727 flight engineer material, I might still get the job.
Well, too bad.
Thank you very much for taking your time.
Yeah, too bad they quit using the 727.
There you go.
I also see that there is, thanks Ray for that. I also see that Kenneth Warren, you have your hand raised, and I'll go ahead and unmute you now as well.
Hey, thank you. I appreciate it. Good evening, John and Martha. I hope things are going well with you in your part of the country.
Well, we're doing fine, Kenneth.
Absolutely. Well, to share with you, thank you for all the things you do and being an inspiration for us younger pilots. I'm a pilot today, thanks to a lot from your classes and the things that you have provided online.
What a privilege for us.
So, question time. So, actually, this is probably better suited for you, Martha. I love flying. I love aviation. However, the significant other in my household isn't such a fan of aviation. So I'd just like to know if you have any tips on how I could bring her more into the fold so she can actually enjoy flying with me. Because we like to travel.
Does she, have you taken the plane and her on trips traveling to the kind of places she likes to go?
No, she's only brave enough to jump in the plane with me one time. We flew out to the lake. I did about a 30-degree banking turn, and she was done. So yeah, I just like to just set her mind and her soul at ease about flying, and hopefully she can go and have more fun with me.
Well, since you didn't ask Martha, but that doesn't stop me. I think that she needs to feel some control, and but
like the flight controls.
No, she needs to feel that's in control of her circumstances.
Control of you is what John means.
But I don't think Martha's ever gotten control of me, so I don't know.
A couple of practical things that might help. We've got a free video called Your First Flying Lesson on Video. You can find it on our homepage. It's free. And in it, John takes a prospective pilot who you never see up for a ride in the plane and shows how the controls work and talks about the stability of the airplane and so on. That would give her knowledge if she's willing to take a look at it that might be useful. And the other thing, and again, it just depends on her her interest, is in a lot of relationships, if the spouse or significant other, whichever one it is that is not the pilot, takes at least part of or finishes a pinch hitter course, so they feel like they're in control, that they know enough to know when something's right and something's wrong, and if anything happened to you, that they could do something about it and not be helpless. Sometimes that helps.
We have a video designed for that. It's called Risk Management for
Reluctant passengers and their pilots.
Right.
Right.
And
that's
so,
not as much on the pinch hitter side.
Well, and it's not
that,
free
though.
either.
No.
but that might be. That was designed for that problem. Is it? And I think if you tell people there are risks, but it's my job to manage those risks and know those risks, and your job to help me manage those risks. I think when we did the video, we had hoped that it was going to revolutionize the world, and people would really jump into the idea of flying when they're afraid of it. But it's called the Risk Management for Reluctant Passengers and their pilots, and it's basically telling the reluctant passenger that we're going to try and fix your pilot. So that they will trust that pilot. It's a real problem.
You're not alone. You're not alone.
Yeah. No.
Right. I also have another hand up here, Hannah Rust. Go ahead.
Awesome, thank you. It's just been so cool hearing all of your stories and everything. But my question is, knowing what you know now, and from the perspective of hindsight, would you do anything differently? Or if you could tell yourself.
I saw that question and I'm ready for you. I'm gonna shock Martha a little bit. There's a lot of things in life to think about you to do differently. Mm-hmm. And the biggest thing, and this very public place to say this, that I would do differently personally, is be nicer to people. And the reason I say that is that I didn't know that I was gonna be successful. And I was clawing to get ahead, and I was impatient with people, impatient with my circumstances. And today, if I could talk to that 15-year-old, 16-year-old kid, I'd say, oh, slow down, just enjoy people, try and be a nice person along the way, and that should be your number one goal. Mm-hmm. And I don't know whether I ever made that my goal, but I would be kinder, more patient with people. I'm thinking about Martha's parents. I could have been a better son-in-law. I could have done a better job for them. And I
think that's true of most son-in-laws, actually.
Probably
so. I think you beat yourself up a little bit. More on that.
Yeah, Martha kind of maybe even disagrees with me. Martha's father was a military officer and a very stern guy, and it was during the Vietnam War, and it was
difficult.
It was a difficult time. It was a time when a lot of young people didn't want us to do the Vietnam War, and so I was a little too opinionated. I could have been kinder, and so that's it for me. Hannah, you want to try one, Martha?
No, I'm going to go back to Kenneth for just a second. And it was several people have mentioned in the chat some really good stuff about having a significant other fly with someone other than yourself if they're very nervous about it, because it's kind of like trying to teach a family member to drive. A lot of times it's better if you get somebody completely outside the family, somebody that they don't worry about, you know, are you going to try and scare me? Are you going to be overly aggressive? You know, that kind of stuff. It gets a little bit less emotion into the whole equation.
Yeah, I still, I think we lost Kenneth.
No,
No,
I'm right here.
no, there he is.
There.
I'm right here. I appreciate you coming back to that and sharing that little bit. I did not think about setting her up with one of the other instructors or someone else to go fly with, you know, versus just jumping in the airplane with me.
Well, she might not see the benefit to her, but on the other hand, she might. And,
yeah, I can see it might be some benefit. I also see where actually giving her a little bit of control, or at least just talking to her as if she was a pilot. Perhaps sharing a few other tasks or something and get her mind off of.
ask her opinions, ask her what she would like to do. Let her kind of be the manager of it. And I think it'd be a lot more fun. People don't like not being in control.
Right. Particularly up in the air. I get that a lot from people I work with or other friends of mine that I share with them that I'm a pilot, and we just have this overall fear about flying because they don't have the control.
Right.
Yeah, you know, I'm almost reluctant to tell strangers that I'm a pilot because it starts a long, they ask what you do. Well, I teach flying, and it starts a long conversation.
Right. Well, great. I greatly appreciate that. So, yeah, hopefully we can curb that fear of hers and we can do more trips.
Well, let us know if you hit on something that works.
Thank you.
I see a question from Laura Savino, I think it is. Did John and I ever consider going to the airlines, or was teaching what you always wanted? Well, one, we have always enjoyed the teaching. John was a teaching assistant in college. But the other thing is that airlines don't let you go through and fly together all the time and both be co-captains together. And that when we got married, we had agreed that we were going to make our lives a partnership, partners in flying, partners in business, partners in everything we did. And you just can't do that with an airline job.
That's why we went bankrupt, really. We agreed to be equal partners in everything we would do, so we tried bankruptcy first. But our idea was to work together, and General Motors won't let you work together, and most big companies and airlines won't let you wouldn't let you in the cockpit together. And so we're entrepreneurs, and we just wanted to live our lives, and we wanted to have it our way, and that let us do that. And I'm not sure that I'd recommend it to anybody, but it's what we decided.
After the bankruptcy, what we did is designed a business that let us fly around the western part of the country in our own airplane and talk to pilots all the time. And at the time, we couldn't imagine anything that would be more fun to do.
Well, life for us is a designer proposition, and we have very frequently people want to try and buy our business, but we don't want to give up the business, so we won't even talk about it.
We're still having fun.
Yeah, we like what we do for a living. This is the life we designed. It's the life we want to continue. We don't want to quit doing it.
That's amazing. I got to tell you real quick, Laura. Captain Laura is going to be, she's with United Airlines. She's going to be our guest speaker on June 9th. And really looking forward to that. So a little plug there. Taking Risks and Fly High is going to be the title of the presentation. So,
well, you know, we just got back from Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia has how many women pilots?
They have 50 women pilots out of 5,000 total pilots in the country.
And
So,
but the fact that we have women pilots, women airline pilots, it's just wonderful. It's just an amazing thing.
Yeah, well, we have for decades.
Yeah, we have. Yeah,
We have a lot more now.
yeah.
yeah.
So there's the world is changing, and there is more opportunity for a lot of people.
Yeah. My talk's going to be about how to take risks, kind of like a little bit the flip side of your talk. So it's going to be a little different.
Okay.
How to do what?
That I'm going to advocate that you should take risks, not flying.
Oh, take risk.
Well,
career-wise, yeah, I see. You're talking about career risks,
well,
right?
Just in life. Just take risks. Always take risks. That's how you get where you want to go. So,
but I think
I would agree with that if they're carefully considered risks.
Right.
I don't mean flying risks. I mean just in life.
Yeah. But and if you know you're taking a risk, I mean, what you want to do is not blindly take.
You don't want to fool yourself, and you don't want to step off a cliff without knowing the cliff is there.
Well, I think if you look at our lives, we're a great example of taking risks. I mean, we went bankrupt and then started right back into business again. Never even considered working for somebody else.
Yep. You are an amazing example.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
Yeah, so I guess we're risk takers. I mean, we just knew what we wanted to do, and all the other alternatives we didn't want to do. So yeah.
I love what you said as far as you designed your life. I mean, it's amazing. I want to be really cognizant of your time. We have about 6 minutes till 9, and perhaps we could wrap up around 9 Eastern time. It'd be, I think, 6 your guys' time, right?
Yes.
I do have another hand up. Unless you all see something in the chat that you'd like to answer, I'd love to have Mike Walpole ask his question as well. But Mike, you want to go for that, Mike? If you're still on, I see your hand up. I can unmute you if you'd like, or there you go. You're all set.
So my wife doesn't fly. She flew with me once. The thing she's done here lately is try to tell me, like, when the weather was good for flying back and forth, and I'm kind of like, hey, if you're going to tell me when the weather's safe for flying, you're going with me. But
work?
No, I haven't tried it yet. But she and we went down to Williamsburg and back, and I never banked more than 10 degrees, and it was dead smooth both ways. And the only thing that was bad was my landings were perfect landings 2 feet above the runway. And we've all done that, but yeah, she's kind of like, no, I'm done. I'm never flying a small plane again. And there's more to the story than that, but I feel the guy's pain. I feel people's pain when the wife won't fly with you, or people won't fly with you because they think these planes are dangerous, and I think you guys are onto something, because what's really dangerous is making bad decisions as a pilot.
Yeah.
We have this is a comment about the approach that some people take that I think is counterproductive. We have a good friend who was starting to learn to fly. This has been years ago, a woman, and she eventually quit right around solo, and we asked her why she quit. And this was before the FAA and flight schools were focused on scenario-based training and so on. But what she said to us was, it is obvious to any reasonably intelligent person that there are significant risks in flying. And my instructor and my flight school are not teaching me to assess and manage them. And so as a reasonably intelligent person, I'm out of here.
And she quit flying because she didn't think they were talking enough about the risks.
And she's a scuba diver, and she does some pretty adventurous scuba diving, which has its own set of risks. But for those of you who have been through a scuba diving course, generally they're really heavy on the issue of, you know, this sport can kill you if you don't pay attention to it. And you need to, you know, here's what you need to do when you're getting ready for a dive and during a dive and dive with a buddy and this kind of stuff. And they lay out the risk pretty clearly, and then they say, and this is how you handle it. And there are people still, unfortunately, in aviation who try and get more people into it by pretending that it's perfectly safe. And you'll hear them say, people will say, is flying safe? And they'll respond by saying, oh yeah, it's perfectly safe. Well, anything you do with a motorized vehicle is not perfectly safe. And particularly not one that's operating up in
It gets in the air.
gets up and gets in the air. And so people don't like the lack of transparency and the lack of honesty about what the risks are. And I think that you really actually get people more interested in learning to fly if you're forthright and honest about those risks than if you try and pretend like there really aren't any.
That's really good information, because I'm kind of working my way through to a flight instructor right now, and it's kind of my retirement plan. So I can keep flying when I'm retired.
A lot of people said that taking up flight instruction is a retirement. Because you're not going to get any jobs. But I'm sorry, it was a joke. It didn't work.
Thanks for the question, Mike. I appreciate it. I had somebody, this isn't a question, but I want to share this with you, John and Martha, because somebody had posted this just now, and you might find this kind of cool. But he was a kid. His name's James Dingle. He's in the chat right now. But this is a picture of him sharing, parking you as a kid. So if you take a look at what I'm sharing right now, that's him in the picture, and you two in your airplane, which I thought was kind of neat. So
well, when was this?
And where?
Let's see. Let me see if James is here. James, you online still?
Yep. Hey, John, Martha, it's James. So that was at the Udvar Hazy Center when you all flew in for the.
Oh, yeah. That was a wonderful time.
Yeah,
that was very special. Yes. When they opened the open house for the center, right?
I'll tell you a funny story. We were introduced. Martha knew Neil Armstrong because she was on a committee with him, and he was very open and friendly towards Martha. And so we're going through the Udvar Hazy Center with Neil Armstrong, and we get to this.
When it opened.
Yeah, when it opened. Yeah. And we get to this kind of Airstream trailer that they put the astronauts who'd been to the moon in and isolated them on a quarantine. And I said, isn't it kind of frustrating that you've been isolated from everybody, and then they take you back and put you in an Airstream trailer and put you in further isolation? He says, oh no, by then we had alcohol. And and I thought that was a funny statement. I just thought it was very open thing for Neil to do. We talked a lot with Neil. I always called him Professor. I never once ever asked him about being on the moon. I just thought you didn't need that. He had that in his whole life. I never did ask him about it. Well, I guess I did if I said it was frustrating to have been in that trailer.
Oh, well, that's not quite the same.
Right,
as being,
like, what was it like to walk on the moon?
Yeah.
So it's right at 9 o'clock, and again, like I said, I want to be cognizant of all your all's time. I have a last question for you. If you were to go on a quote $100 hamburger, where would you go? You've been everywhere, but where would you go back to, or what's your favorite $100 hamburger?
Catalina is a pretty nice place for it. It's a beautiful island off Los Angeles with the airport in the sky right at the top up there.
Yeah, and it is a $100 hamburger because they serve buffalo burgers there.
That's correct. That's correct.
That's great. Well, we do a lot of Smokehouse Pilots flyouts, and more of the $100 hamburger feel. So I was just curious.
It's a bit
here on
far
the
for
East
your
Coast,
folks
but-
to come, probably.
Yeah. We like
Yeah,
going-
absolutely.
In the winter time, it's fun to go to the desert. The desert's a little warmer. So we'll get, one of the things we fly all the time is that we keep current in a helicopter. And so we really, for just going flying for just the fun of it, it's just hard to beat VFR flying in a helicopter. It's just marvelous.
There's a hotel over in the desert. It's about 40 minutes away in the little Robinson that we fly, that has marked out an area right next to the hotel and said to us, you know, you can land here anytime you want to. We'd love to have you come in. So we go over there and land and go in and have lunch called Casa del Zorro. And it's a fun place to go.
It's one of the nice things about flying a helicopter is you can very often land in a restaurant's parking lot and just walk in. Yeah. You don't want to slice anybody up. It gets blood on the helicopter. But in any event, if you do it well, it's a lot of fun.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. Do you have anything else that you saw in that chat that you want to address, or I don't want to move too fast on you. But I think we're good to go.
I would say thanks everybody for putting up with us. It was a great evening.
It's been a lot of fun. Thank you very much.
What a spectacular bunch of people to be around. What a great club you guys have. That's marvelous.
Hey, thank you all so much for joining us. And John and Martha, thank you so much for all of the time and effort leading up to this as well. And Martha, it was great going back and forth with you. But just a massive amount of gratitude for all of what you've done within general aviation and aviation in itself. So from all of us, we so much thank you. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you all so much for joining us.
Great club. Good night, everybody. Have a wonderful evening.
Right, take care.
Good night, John and Martha.
Good night.
Thank you.